Every night at midnight I hear footsteps among the graves, but when I turn there is no one there, only the shadow of what I can't explain.
Have you ever wondered what would happen if someone were buried, still breathing? It's a thought almost no one dares to entertain, because just imagining it brings a tightness to the chest, as if the air were thinning and darkness were closing in on us. But what if I told you there's a story that goes far beyond imagination, a tale told by someone who knew the cemetery like the back of their hand? A simple gravedigger, accustomed to the routine of digging and closing graves, swears he experienced something that made him doubt his own sanity. He claims that one night he heard labored breathing coming from inside a newly closed coffin, as if death hadn't fully completed its work. Imagine the scene. Absolute silence, the moon hidden behind the clouds, and only the creaking of the trees swaying in the wind. The man stops, gripping the flashlight tightly, and tries to convince himself it's just his mind playing tricks. But the sound is clear, rhythmic, desperate, as if someone were suffocating underground. Could you take another step, or would you run away without looking back? It was that night that his life changed forever. It wasn't a distant noise or an echo. He could have sworn air was escaping from his lungs and throat, as if a body were fighting to avoid being swallowed by eternal darkness. And the most disturbing thing was that this wasn't an isolated incident, but merely the first sign that something in that cemetery was wrong, deeply wrong, if you want to. Discover how far these Gravediggers stories can take us. Subscribe to the channel right now and leave your like, because the next stories will mess with your mind in ways you never imagined. My name doesn't matter here, because anyone who had experienced what I did would have preferred anonymity. What you need to know is that I worked in a small, remote cemetery in rural Pennsylvania, a place forgotten by time, where the routine was always the same, and the silence of the night seemed to carry a supernatural weight. There were no guards, no cameras, just me, a shovel, and the sound of my own footsteps crunching the gravel between the graves. Some would say it was lonely work, but for me it was more than that. It was a daily coexistence with death and with the suffocating silence it imposed each night. Many imagine a gravedigger's life to be filled with macabre conversations or fantastical stories, but the truth is much harsher. It's hard work, sweat, a biting cold, and a constant feeling that, as you finish each burial, you're also sealing something inside yourself. I was already accustomed to hearing the whispers of the wind and feeling the creaking of the trees, as if they were voices trying to accompany me. But until then, it was all just the ordinary sounds of a cold night. At least that's what I tried to believe. In that cemetery, the days were monotonous, but the nights, those were different. Sometimes I walked among the tombs and noticed how each shadow seemed to have its own form, almost human, as if those resting there had risen just to observe me. Ancient records showed that the site was over 150 years old, and many of those coffins had been buried in haste during times of epidemics and mass accidents. No one ever bothered to revisit these dead, as if abandonment were part of the landscape itself. And it was precisely in this cold routine, marked by funerals that rarely received visitors, that I learned to live with absolute silence. But that night, when I heard the muffled sound coming from the earth, all this silence took on a new meaning. It wasn't just loneliness that accompanied me. There was something alive, pulsating, trying to communicate with me from within the darkness. On the night of the burial that changed everything, I was already exhausted. I'd finished later than usual because the family insisted on a simple but lengthy ceremony before the casket. After everyone left, I stayed to finish the job, adjusting the newly removed earth and ensuring the grave was properly closed. It was just another grave among many. Nothing seemed special or different, but for some reason I couldn't explain. I felt an unusual uneasiness as I leveled the ground. The wind was stronger, and the sound of dry leaves dragging across the ground created an uneasy melody, almost a warning. I finished the work and began gathering up my tools, but then it happened. At first, it was a subtle noise, like the rustling of someone moving underground. I thought it was just my tired mind, until the sound repeated louder, more defined, a rhythmic, deep sound that in no way resembled the sounds of nature. I approached hesitantly, flashlight in hand, and it was at that moment that I recognized it. It was breathing, human breaths, panting, desperate, coming from inside the freshly buried coffin. My heart raced, and for a few seconds I considered running, abandoning everything, and never returning. But reason kept me. Standing there, trying to find an explanation. Maybe it was just an echo, an illusion caused by the wind seeping through the cracks in the loose earth. Maybe it was the wood creaking under the pressure of the soil. But the more I tried to rationalize, the more impossible it became to ignore. Those breaths had rhythm, they had urgency. They were real. I stood still, my flickering flashlight illuminating the mound of fresh earth as the sound faded, then fell silent completely, as if the air itself had given up its struggle against the weight of the earth. And it was in this absolute silence that I realized something even more frightening. There was no one but me to witness it. No one to confirm or deny what my ears had just recorded. What should I do at that moment? Open the tomb immediately, call someone, or simply convince myself it was all a delusion? This doubt haunted me throughout the night, until the decision I made the next day would change everything. The next morning I couldn't simply get out of bed and go about my daily life as if nothing had happened. The memory of those breaths echoed inside me like a muffled drum, and every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the desperation of someone trying to escape from underground, fighting against the darkness and the lack of air. I spent hours convincing myself to ignore it, but the truth is, my conscience wouldn't allow me to live in peace if I wasn't certain of what I'd heard. And so, when the sun was already high, I returned to the cemetery, trying to appear calm, as if it were just another day at work. I carried my tools with me, but this time not to dig a new grave, but to reopen the one I had closed hours before. Every movement brought a lump to my throat, and every shovelful of earth removed added to the weight of doubt. What if I had actually buried someone alive? What if at that moment the townspeople saw me digging up a body? What would they say? These questions tormented me, but nothing would stop me. I needed to know. When I finally reached the coffin, my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was about to leap out of my chest. The wood was intact on the outside, with no sign of tampering. With trembling hands, I pried open the lid and slowly lifted it, prepared for whatever scene I might encounter. But what I saw left me even more disturbed than I could have imagined. The body lay motionless, with no sign of life. However, the coffin's interior walls were marked by deep scratches, grooves that betrayed a desperate struggle, as if nails and fingers had worn away in a futile attempt to escape. I recoiled, unable to process it. The medical records were clear. The death had been confirmed days earlier, leaving no room for error. But how could I explain those signs? How could I justify marks that could only have been made by someone conscious? I closed the coffin again, but the feeling that I had witnessed something impossible would stay with me ever since. And it was precisely from that moment on that I realized that the breathing I heard that night wasn't just an isolated sound. It was a dark warning that something much deeper was about to begin. The days that followed were the hardest of my life. I tried to get back into my routine, burying new bodies, cleaning the stone corridors, arranging the dried flowers that families left behind. But nothing felt normal. Every time I passed the area where that grave lay, an invisible pressure gripped my chest, as if something was pushing me down, draining my energy. I didn't need to look directly to know it was there, because the very environment betrayed its presence. The wind grew colder, the birds avoided perching on the nearby trees, and even the neighborhood dogs, which sometimes wandered the cemetery, never approached that part. At night, when the city's silence enveloped everything like a shroud, the noises would haunt me again. They were no longer clear breathing, but whispers carried by gusts of wind that seemed to utter words I couldn't understand. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was standing over my bed, watching my every breath. And the most disturbing thing was that, even alone in the house, I was certain I wasn't alone. The air grew heavy, and the same oppression I felt in the cemetery seemed to have passed through the gates and made its way into my own home. I began avoiding the area where the coffin had been buried. I made excuses, pretended I needed to attend to other areas, but deep down I knew I was just trying to escape the inevitable. No matter where I went, there was always something pulling me back, as if the tomb had become an invisible magnet. In my dreams, I relived the scene from the night I heard the breathing. Only in my dreams, it wasn't just a sound coming from underground. It was a cry for help, a suffocating plea, and sometimes even a muffled scream that woke me in a cold sweat. The more I tried to push these thoughts away, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. Walking alone in the cemetery became unbearable. The shadows that had previously seemed harmless now had defined shapes, as if arms and faces were hidden in the marble and granite walls. At every corner, I felt something moving behind me, and when I turned, I found nothing but emptiness. I began to question my own sanity. Perhaps I was going mad. Perhaps I had projected all that terror into my mind from a single, inexplicable sound. But there were too many details, too many coincidences to be mere figments of imagination. The scratch-marked coffin, the persistent whispers, the chill that lingered even on sunny days. All of this pointed to something real, something that couldn't be erased, with the excuse of delusion. The climax came on a Friday night, when I had to cross the area where the tomb was located to reach the tool shed. I was already accustomed to the discomfort, but this time, the sensation was different. It wasn't just the impression of being watched. It was an absolute certainty. I felt footsteps behind me, steady, in sync with mine, as if someone were marching in my shadow. I stopped. The sound stopped. I resumed walking. The sound began again, and it was in that instant that I realized that the presence wasn't trapped underground. It had found a way out, and now it walked beside me, invisible but palpable, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The last time I had to pass by that tomb, something happened that to this day makes me doubt whether I'm truly still sane. The wind suddenly died, and the darkness seemed to close in on me, as if the entire cemetery had stopped to watch what was about to happen. It was then that I felt it. A cold, bony hand rested on my shoulder with a firmness that left no room for doubt. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't my imagination, it wasn't the weight of guilt. It was the physical touch of someone who supposedly should no longer be among the living. My body froze, and when I finally summoned the courage to turn around, there was no one behind me. Only the suffocating silence and the feeling that something invisible was smiling in the darkness. Since that night, I've never been able to walk those lands without feeling death following me closely. And the most disturbing thing is that talking to other gravediggers, I realized I wasn't the only one to have this kind of experience. Some swear they've seen processions of shadows walking among the tombstones, but that's a story you'll never hear. Have you ever wondered what you would do if on a full moon you saw the dead you buried rise before your eyes? It may seem impossible, a delusion brought on by fear or loneliness, but I assure you that what I witnessed was not a figment of my imagination. It was real as the chill that runs down my spine, now just remembering it. I was alone, as always, in that vast expanse of silent tombstones. When I noticed something I can't erase from my memory, a silent procession emerging from the darkness, formed by translucent figures walking in a line, obeying an invisible call. What struck me most was not only the absolute silence with which they advanced, but the cadence of their steps, as if there were an ancient order, a secret ritual that had been repeated for centuries without anyone daring to tell. The moonlight reflected on their features, giving them an appearance at once fragile and imposing, as if trapped between two worlds, condemned to wander restlessly. There was no rush, no noise, just that supernatural procession slowly moving toward the heart of the cemetery, toward the abandoned chapel in the center of the grounds. At that moment, I was torn between the instinct to flee and the irresistible need to observe, because something inside me told me that that night held answers that I perhaps wasn't ready to hear. If you want to discover how far these Gravediggers stories can take us, subscribe to the channel right now and leave your like, because the next stories will mess with your mind in ways you never imagined. That cemetery had an aura of its own, an invisible weight that seemed to cling to those who dared to cross its gates after sunset. Located in a small, forgotten town in rural Massachusetts, the place held more than ancient tombstones and twisted trees. It held memories buried alongside the bodies that lay there. By day, it was just a silent field of uneven lawns, wilted flowers, and moss-covered stones. But as night fell, everything changed. The silence took on an oppressive tone, and each shadow stretched as if with a life of its own, forming silhouettes that watched us silently. In the center of the lot stood the abandoned chapel, built in the 19th century by immigrants who, according to city records, believed the space should be sacred. Today, however, it is nothing more than a gloomy ruin. The stained glass windows that once reflected the colorful light were shattered, leaving only sharp fragments that glinted in the moonlight. Like glass knives, the main door had been sealed for decades, but the swollen wood and corroded hardware gave the feeling that, at any moment, something could force its way in from the inside out. Many locals shared stories about this chapel, but few dared to repeat the details. Some said the bell, now gone, still rang on certain nights, calling lost souls to an invisible cult. Others swore that when someone died without receiving their last prayers, their spirit found no rest and was drawn into it, as if it were a black altar where prayers never reached heaven. I myself never took these stories seriously, until the night my own eyes witnessed what happened when the full moon illuminated those ruins. It was impossible not to feel that the entire atmosphere of the cemetery revolved around that chapel. The air grew colder as you approached it, and the sounds of the night, crickets, owls, even the wind through the trees, simply disappeared. Everything fell silent, as if respecting the presence of something greater, something hidden. And it was in this absolute silence, with the moon reflecting off the stones and the corridor of tombstones forming a natural path toward the building, that I saw the first signs of what would forever change my perception of the dead. It was during a night patrol that everything began to unfold before my eyes. I was walking slowly between the rows of tombstones, carrying only a flashlight that barely illuminated a few meters ahead, when I realized something was different that night. The air seemed denser, almost viscous, as if it were difficult to breathe, and the light of the full moon created strange reflections on the ground, transforming the shadows into elongated figures that moved without the wind. I was already accustomed to feeling a certain unease during my vigils, but there was something deeper in that atmosphere, something that seemed to prepare me to witness the inexplicable. Suddenly, in the distance, I saw a pale glow emerge. Between the tombstones, like mist taking shape, I stared intently and realized it wasn't mist at all, but the silhouette of a translucent figure walking with slow, steady steps. My heart raced and my legs hesitated, but curiosity compelled me to remain still, captivated by the spectacle unfolding before me. I soon realized it wasn't just one figure. 1, 2, 3, 10. Within minutes, dozens of them appeared, forming a continuous line that stretched out like a silent procession. The most impressive thing about that procession was the discipline. None of them strayed from the path, none looked to the side, none made a sound. They simply walked, in perfect cadence, as if obeying an ancient and irresistible order. The silence became even more terrifying than any scream, because the absence of sound made each step an unbearable weight on my mind. I felt I was not just witnessing something supernatural, but witnessing a ritual that should never be seen by the living. As I watched, I noticed that all the figures were walking toward the abandoned chapel in the center of the cemetery, as if drawn by an invisible thread. Their translucent bodies reflected the moonlight, but what disturbed me most was the sensation that each step they took reverberated within me, as if a part of my soul were being pulled along toward that unknown destination. It was at that moment that I understood that this was no mere phenomenon, but a calling that somehow also included me. As the procession advanced toward the chapel, I, overcome by a mixture of fear and fascination, crept a little closer. The lantern in my hands trembled, its light seeming too dim to face that darkness that seemed alive. But it was at that moment that I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Among those translucent figures, some faces were familiar. At first, I thought it was just an illusion created by my tired mind. But the more I observed, the more impossible it became to deny. These were people I myself had buried in recent months. I recognized the elderly man who had died of pneumonia and whose family wept desperately as I closed the coffin. I also saw the young woman who had been the victim of an accident on the nearby road, the same woman whose wedding ring had still been in my pocket for days, until I managed to hand it to her weeping husband. Even the children were there, marching in silence, their eyes fixed on a distant point, completely oblivious to my presence. With each face I recognized, a sense of horror grew within me, because they were not unknown ghosts or anonymous shadows. They were dead people who had passed through my hands, buried under my care, now walking as if they had never rested. That macabre parade didn't feel like a chance encounter, but like a trial. It was as if each figure appeared simply to remind me of the weight of my job, to exact from me an invisible debt I'd never realized I bore. I couldn't look away, and the longer I stared at those empty faces, the more convinced I became that they were aware of my presence. The terror lay not only in recognizing them, but in feeling that they recognized me too. It was at that point that I realized I wasn't just observing a procession of ghosts. I was part of it somehow, even if I didn't know how or why. And as the silent line approached the abandoned chapel, something inside me told me that if I continued to follow them, I would discover truths that could never be forgotten. It was impossible to resist the urge to follow them. Something about that procession called to me in a way I can't explain in words, as if a silent voice whispered within me, compelling me to walk behind them. Each step I took seemed to distance me from the world of the living and bring me closer to a dimension where the rules were no longer the same. The air around me grew increasingly cold, and an indescribable weight fell upon my shoulders, as if I were being pushed into a destiny not my own. Still, I kept moving forward, mesmerized by the cadence of the ghostly march that stretched out before me. As I approached, I noticed details that terrified me. The figures' clothing exactly mirrored the clothing in which I had buried them. The worn suits, the simple dresses, the uniforms. The children still wore the small shoes I had seen placed in the coffin. This fidelity to detail left no room for doubt. They were truly the same bodies, but now transformed into spectres obeying an unknown call. The sound of my footsteps echoed among the tombstones, but the procession remained in absolute silence, oblivious to my presence, until one of them stopped. It was as if the entire weight of the night had fallen upon me in that instant. One of the figures stopped walking, slowly turned, and stared at me. There were no eyes, just two empty holes that glowed with a faint, icy light. Yet I felt as if that gaze pierced my entire soul, revealing all my secrets and sins. My legs trembled, and for a moment I thought I couldn't support myself. I wanted to run, but it was as if I were rooted to the spot, chained by something invisible that held me to the ground before that entity. Most disturbingly, when this figure fixed its gaze on me, the entire procession seemed to sense my presence. There was no sudden movement or sound, only a barely perceptible shift in the air, as if each of those shadows had turned its attention to me. The sensation of being watched by dozens of invisible eyes was more suffocating than any scream, more paralyzing than any physical threat. I was no longer a mere spectator. I had been noticed, marked, somehow included in this silent ritual. The figure then turned back to the chapel and resumed walking, as if nothing had happened. But I knew something had changed. My chest burned, my breath caught, and with each step I took after them, I felt like I was crossing a threshold from which I might never return. Still, I was unable to stop. Something inside me demanded that I find out what happened when those chapel doors finally opened to receive the procession of the dead. When the procession finally arrived in front of the chapel, the silence became so heavy I could almost hear my own blood rushing through my veins. The wooden doors, sealed for decades, began to creak on their own, slowly opening as if obeying only the presence of those no longer of the living. Dense darkness filled the entrance, and there seemed to be nothing inside but absolute emptiness, an abyss that swallowed all the light around it. The figures entered one by one, disappearing as if absorbed by an endless space. I hesitated, trying to muster the courage to approach and peer inside, but when I finally took a step forward, I felt something shift behind me. I turned my head and saw that among the more distant tombstones, new figures were beginning to emerge. The detail that made me freeze was not their presence, but the fact that, among them, there was a living face. Someone I knew very well, someone not yet dead, walked among the spectres as if already summoned to this march. Have you ever stopped to think what you would do if, in the middle of the night, you heard a voice praying inside a tomb that had been sealed for over a century? It seems impossible, I know, but that's exactly what happened to me, and to this day, I can't decide if it was a curse, a revelation, or just the beginning of a madness I've never escaped. It was always the same nights, always at the same time, exactly as the clock struck midnight. The absolute silence of the cemetery was broken by a voice emerging from within the cold stone, repeating prayers as if part of an endless ritual. At first, I thought it was just fatigue, because working surrounded by tombstones and forgotten stories can mess with anyone's mind. But the insistence of that sound, the clarity of the words and the cadence of the prayer were so real that I soon realized I wasn't dreaming. What terrified me most wasn't just hearing the voice, but the fact that it always came from the same place. Tomb number 37, a tomb that by all accounts had been sealed since the 19th century. And the more I listened to those prayers, the more a strange sensation invaded me, as if that invisible presence knew I was there, listening to every word. If you want to discover how far these Gravediggers stories can take us, subscribe to the channel right now and leave your like, because the next stories will mess with your mind in ways you never imagined. The cemetery where I worked wasn't like the ones you see in big cities. Well lit, with security guards and cameras. It was on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, a place that bore a heavy legacy of war, slavery, and ancient epidemics. It was a vast field where ancient oaks bent under the weight of Spanish moss, and their shadows stretched out like twisted arms that seemed to ensnare anyone who dared cross the gates after sunset. By day, it was simply a melancholy, silent space. But when night fell, every stone, every tree, and every cross seemed to take on a life of its own, and I felt like I was walking in territory that didn't belong to me. Among all the tombs, there was one that stood out, not for its grandeur, but for the atmosphere it exuded. Number 37, constructed of white marble, now worn and covered in dark stains, its iron door was sealed with rusty chains that no one dared touch. Cemetery records, stored in dusty boxes in the office, showed that no one had been buried there since the late 19th century. Still, all the staff knew something was wrong with the place. Some avoided even saying the number aloud, as if naming the tomb would bring bad luck. Some long-time residents said that anyone passing near it at night felt the air change, becoming colder and denser, and others swore they saw figures kneeling in front of its entrance like worshippers before an invisible altar. I always dismissed these stories as the exaggerations of impressionable people until the voices began. And when you're alone among so many dead, believing or not, believing is no longer a choice. The entire cemetery seemed to revolve around that tomb, as if it were the center of a force that kept everything in balance. And it was right there that I realized my life would never be the same after that first night of whispers. The first time I heard that voice was one sultry dawn, when the moon barely illuminated the path through the trees. I was finishing a routine round, walking slowly among the tombs, when I noticed a low sound that clashed with the heavy silence that reigned in the place. It was like a distant murmur, almost muffled but rhythmic, as if following an ancient cadence. At first, I thought it was the wind rushing through some crack in the ruined chapel, but I soon realized otherwise. The words repeated themselves, forming whole sentences, and the more I listened, the clearer it became that it was a prayer. I returned the following night, and the phenomenon repeated itself, always at the same time, midnight sharp. The voice emerged from within tomb 37, firm and deep, as if a priest was celebrating a secret mass. Sometimes it seemed to be in archaic English, with expressions no longer used, and at other times it sounded like Latin, a heavy, heavy Latin that echoed within my chest. This couldn't be a coincidence. It wasn't just my tired mind or a cruel trick of the wind. It was something that followed a pattern, as if someone were actually inside, repeating prayers for over a century. The nights passed, and the repetition became almost torture. I already knew that when the clock struck midnight, that litany would begin again, seeping into my ears and dominating my body with a mixture of fascination and fear. Most disturbingly, no matter how much I tried to convince myself to ignore it, there was something in the intonation of the voice that seemed to call directly to me, as if it knew I was there, standing outside, listening to every word that echoed in the silence. And it was at that point that I realized I couldn't resist for much longer. Sooner or later, I would have to get closer to find out who or what was praying inside that sealed tomb. It took several nights before I mustered the courage to approach tomb 37. I knew the voice would appear, always at the same time, always with that ritualistic cadence that chilled me to the core. but something inside me resisted crossing the invisible line that seemed to separate that tomb from the rest of the cemetery. It was as if a barrier of fear prevented me from approaching, a feeling that by setting foot before it, I would be crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Even so, on a dawn when the sky was clear and the moon illuminated every stone, I decided I could postpone it no longer. Approaching it was like walking into a sudden winter. Each step I took seemed to drain the heat from my body, and I soon realized the temperature around me was plummeting. The air became thicker, harder to breathe, and the simple act of moving forward required an effort that was not physical, but psychological, as if my entire being were fighting the idea of touching that tomb. The voice, however, remained firm, echoing within the stone as if unconcerned by my presence. When I finally reached out and touched the cool marble surface, everything abruptly stopped. The prayer was cut off mid-sentence, and the silence that followed was not the usual silence of a cemetery. It was a suffocating emptiness so intense it made me believe even the sounds of the distant city had been swallowed up. I immediately withdrew my hand, and for a moment I was certain someone deep inside had felt my touch. That night I returned home convinced that the tomb not only hid a secret, but also held a waking consciousness. I needed to discover who had been buried there and why he still prayed, imprisoned in that stone, more than a century after his death. After that night, when the voice ceased at the exact moment I touched the tomb, my mind found no rest. I spent entire days obsessed with the need to understand what was happening. I no longer wanted to simply confirm the existence of something supernatural. I needed to understand the origin of that presence. And so, I began to comb through the city's ancient records, delving into dusty archives that no one had consulted for decades. On the shelves of the small municipal library, I found fragile volumes of 19th century newspapers, yellowed pages that held more than just news. They held fragments of tragedies that time had tried to bury. It was there that the name of the family linked to Grave 37 appeared before me. The Halloways. A family of influential merchants, respected by the community, but carrying a shadow no one dared mention aloud. I discovered that they had all died on the same night during a fire that consumed the old mansion in the city centre. The disturbing detail is that official reports never explained the cause of the flames. Some said it was an accident involving oil lamps, others suggested it was divine punishment. But among the discreet lines of the reports, I found much more sinister rumours. It was said that the family patriarch, Elias Halloway, was a man obsessed with power and secretly engaged in occult practices. Neighbours claimed to hear strange chants coming from the house in the early hours of the morning and believed he had made dark pacts, seeking to prolong his life in exchange for dark devotions. When the tragedy struck, many began to say that the fire was no accident, but the price exacted by forces he himself had summoned. Elias's body was never found amid the ashes, but records indicate that shortly afterward, his family purchased plot number 37 and sealed it permanently, as if to forever imprison something that should never escape. Since then, no one has been buried there, and the tomb has become known as a cursed place, avoided even by the gravediggers of the time. When I connected this information to what I had witnessed, everything seemed to take on a terrifying meaning. The voice I heard was no ordinary manifestation, but perhaps that of Elijah, condemned to eternal prayer, seeking salvation that would never come. A man who, in life, sought power in dark rituals, and who now, after death, was trapped within the very darkness he had summoned. The revelation left me astonished, but it also raised a new question. If that voice was capable of praying night after night, what would happen when it stopped praying? The next night I decided to return to the cemetery, my mind burdened by the discoveries I had made. The clock was approaching midnight, and each second seemed to drag on like an eternity. When the distant chimes finally sounded, the prayer began again, dense, drawn out, repeating words that were already familiar to me. This time, however, something was different. The cadence wasn't the same. There was a hesitation between phrases, as if the voice were fighting against itself to maintain the rhythm. The cold around me became unbearable, and my fingers trembled uncontrollably. I walked forward until I stood before the tomb and remained motionless, observing that silent structure that seemed to vibrate with the sound coming from within. And then, just as I prepared to walk away, the prayer abruptly ceased, cut off mid-word. The silence that followed was so profound that it felt as if even my heart had stopped beating. It was in this absolute emptiness that I heard, for the first time, the voice speak my name. It wasn't a plea nor a prayer, but a direct call, charged with an intimacy that made me feel as if I were being watched from within the stone. At that moment, I realized that the curse of Tomb 37 wasn't just a secret buried in the past, but something that now enveloped me. And perhaps I wasn't the only gravedigger marked by voices coming from the darkness, because other colleagues had their own confessions, stories even more disturbing than mine. There are moments in life when we are confronted with something so strange and disturbing that even our memory seems to fight against it, as if trying to erase it to spare us from insanity. It was on one of those lonely nights, patrolling the cemetery, that I had an experience I've never been able to explain, an encounter that defied all logic and left me with the feeling that certain presences walk among us only to remind us that death is not the end, but the beginning of something even more and terrifying. As I walked through the silent lanes, shining my flashlight between the tombstones, my eyes fell on a motionless figure, standing before an ancient cross. At first, I thought it was an intruder, perhaps someone who had snuck into the cemetery to vandalize or perform some strange ritual. But something about the posture made me uneasy. The body stood erect, rigid, like a sentry guarding an unspeakable secret. My heart raced, and even without understanding why, I had the feeling this wasn't just a simple encounter with a human being. This was beyond. And when I decided to shine a brighter light to understand who was standing before that cross, I discovered I was about to face something I'll never forget. If you want to discover how far these Gravediggers stories can take us, subscribe to the channel right now and leave your like, because the next stories will mess with your mind in ways you never imagined. The cemetery where I worked wasn't one of those well-lit places, guarded by cameras and modern patrols. It was a secluded ancient field, nestled in a small, rural New England town, a place where the cold seemed to seep into the bones and where history clung to the walls of the ruined chapels. At night, the space transformed into a maze of shadows, and every tree seemed to hide something in its silence. My rounds always began after 11, and it was just me, my flashlight, and the sound of gravel underfoot. The solitude became so dense that, at times, I felt as if even my breathing was at odds with the surroundings. I tried to convince myself that the job was simple, almost mechanical, walking the alleys, checking for trespassers, making sure no vandals had breached the gates. Yet there were nights when every shadow watched me. Every gravestone seemed to tilt slightly as I passed, as if to witness my steps. The absolute silence made even the slightest snap of a twig sound like a scream. It was in this state of constant tension that I had to keep going, prowling, repeating the same path, always with the feeling that something was following me just a few meters away, just out of the reach of light. There were specific places in the cemetery that bothered me most, spots where the air seemed heavier and time slowed. One such area was right near an ancient weathered cross, where the stone stood like a forgotten monument. I avoided passing by, not because I believed in legends, but because my entire body rejected that space. And it was precisely there that, on a seemingly ordinary night, I spotted the motionless figure that would forever change the way I viewed the nightly rounds. That night, the wind seemed heavier than usual, as if each gust carried with it fragments of ancient voices, whispers that were lost among the tombstones. I walked slowly, repeating the route I already knew by heart, when my eyes fixed on something that shouldn't have been there. Before the ancient cross, in the very spot I'd so often avoided, stood a figure. Its back was to me, motionless, with the rigidity of a statue carved in pitch darkness. At first, my instinct was to rationalize. Some intruder, perhaps a drunk who'd snuck in, or even a teenager trying his hand in the middle of the cemetery. But the more I watched, the more something seemed wrong. The silhouette displayed none of the slightest movements of a human body. There were no tremors, no adjustments in posture, not even the slightest sway of breathing. It was a fixed presence, as if it had been placed there on purpose, waiting for me. I clutched the flashlight in my hands, trying to summon the courage to approach, but each step seemed to carry a ton of fear. I called out loud, breaking the silence with an authoritative tone, but the figure didn't respond. No gesture, no sound, nothing, just the same position, as if the voice had pierced the air without even reaching that presence. My heart was pounding so hard it seemed to echo through my chest, and with each passing second the certainty grew that what I was facing wasn't human. Even so, my professional instinct compelled me to continue. I needed to be certain of what was before me, to confirm that it was merely an intruder before my mind convinced me I was face to face with something supernatural. It was then that I raised the flashlight and directed the beam directly at the figure. What I saw in that instant made me realize that nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for that sight. The flashlight's light cut through the darkness, finally revealing what until then had been merely a silhouette. The beam illuminated the figure's outline, the straight shoulders, the still posture. But when I reached the face, there was nothing. No human features, no detail that could give the being its identity. Where eyes, mouth and nose should have been, there was only a smooth, pale surface, as if someone had erased its essence, leaving only emptiness. The sensation was so intense that I had to take a few steps back, unable to believe what my own eyes were recording. My entire body shivered, and for a moment I thought I might faint. My mind raced for explanations. Perhaps a mask, perhaps an illusion caused by the reflection of light. But no, this wasn't a trick. It was something that transcended logic, a human body without identity, a being that seemed to exist only to defy reason. Most disturbingly, even without eyes, I had the clear and undeniable sensation of being watched. There was no way to explain it, but the absence of features conveyed a presence so intense it seemed to penetrate my skin and penetrate straight to my core. I tried to speak again, but my voice faltered, as if my throat had been encased in ice. The silence that enveloped us was absolute, save for the muffled sound of the wind rustling through the distant trees. The figure remained motionless, unresponsive, and yet every fiber of my being screamed that it was aware of my presence, that it was somehow staring at me. From within that expressionless void, it was at that moment that I realized this wasn't just a passing encounter, but something much deeper and more threatening. And what happened next only reinforced that certainty. I stood paralyzed before that faceless figure, unsure whether to run or move closer, as if an invisible force pinned me to the ground and simultaneously pushed me forward. The flashlight's light trembled in my hands, reflecting against the smooth surface where a face should have been, and in that instant, something began to change. Gradually, as if made of smoke, the body of that presence began to fade before me. First, the outlines of the arms, then the torso, until only a faint shadow remained, seemingly carried away by the wind. I expected the weight of that sensation to disappear along with the image, but the opposite happened. The more the body dissolved into thin air, the more the environment around me seemed to come alive. The cold intensified, the air became thick as fog, and the absolute silence was shattered by something even more terrifying, the sound of footsteps. Clear, firm footsteps, as if someone were walking right behind me. The disturbing detail was that the sounds didn't coincide with my movements. As I remained motionless, trying to understand what was happening, the echo of the footsteps traveled through the space between the graves, approaching from different directions. I turned the flashlight in every direction, but there was no one. The cemetery seemed empty, and yet the footsteps continued, reverberating on the ground as if made of stone against stone. With each echo, my heart beat faster, and an unbearable feeling of persecution washed over me. I wasn't alone, and worse, what accompanied me didn't need a body to be present. I walked forward a few meters, trying to ignore the sound, but soon realized the footsteps were following me, reproducing the same rhythm, like an invisible shadow glued to my being. The faster I sped up, the more insistent they became, and soon they were in perfect sync with mine, as if something were walking beside me, unseen. The psychological terror was beyond bearing when, suddenly, the footsteps stopped, leaving a silence so dense it made me believe the entire world had held its breath. For a moment I thought it was over, but at the exact moment I tried to calm down. A new sequence of footsteps appeared, this time faster, as if it were running towards me. I ran toward the cemetery gate, my heart pounding like a drum about to burst. The sound of footsteps behind me didn't diminish. On the contrary, it seemed to grow stronger, as if the invisible presence had found pleasure in hunting me. The flashlight swayed in my hands, casting distorted shadows that transformed the trees into twisted creatures ready to swallow me. When I finally reached the exit, I turned instinctively, seeking one last confirmation that nothing else was there. But what I saw was far worse than my mind had imagined. A few meters away, before another ancient cross, the same faceless figure had returned. It stood motionless, erect as before, as if it had never dissolved into thin air. The void where a face should have been seemed to stare at me silently, and even from a safe distance I felt as if its eyelessness were penetrating me. It was as if, no matter where I ran, that presence would always find a new cross to watch over, always waiting for me, eternal, patient, tireless. That night, I realized there was no escaping the gaze of something faceless, and ever since, I've carried the feeling that it still watches me, not just in the cemetery, but everywhere I go. If you also believe that stories like this reveal the darker side of existence, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. That way, you'll never miss future stories that continue to explore the most disturbing secrets of forgotten cemeteries.